we replace an EGR valve and clear an engine code. Welcome to the next video. In this video, we will take a look on how to replace the EGR valve. The valve is a part of a more complex system enabling to recirculate a portion of exhaust gases back to the intake. In the system, an EGR cooler and an EGR valve are present. For this type of engine, the EGR cooler is mounted on the back of the engine under the turbo and the valve is installed on the intake. Now, if the EGR valve is faulty, it will eventually end up in limp mode. Faulty meaning it does not behave the way that the engine control module is expecting. And if you end up in limp mode, you won't have full power of the car and it's just gonna get totally annoying. Well, anyway, here's my engine code, and basically what it does that only when accelerating and hitting shown RPMs the engine code shows up if the valve isn't really closed yet. Meaning if you accelerate from about 1500 RPM, everything's fine. Nevertheless, you want the car to work perfectly, therefore we're going to fix this issue. You can see that there are two engine codes, two different cases at the same RPM and the same air mass sensor value. To be sure, I actually spoke to an expert on these EGR valves, and he basically said that whenever there is an error from the control module of the engine, it simply means that the part is just not behaving the way it should, it's faulty and it needs to be replaced. It doesn't matter if the engine code says that the error is sporadic or intermittent. It just basically shows you how often it happens. In this case you can see it's sporadic from the code, but still the valve is not behaving the way it should and therefore it needs to be replaced because perhaps some mechanical part in the valve, most probably the motor, isn't responding to the voltage by which the control module controls the valve. So we are going to replace it and we're going to show how to do it. So this is the EGR valve specifically for this type of engine, thankfully on the intake because it's easy to reach. As for most engines you would have to go behind the engine under the turbo and unmount the whole EGR valve together with the cooling part, which is hell of a job. So we start by removing the hose on the bottom, which is held in place by two metal clips. For that, just use a screwdriver. It's quite easy to take it out, though you might be fighting with space a little bit, but it's definitely doable at home. I've just disconnected the link for the throttle body to get some more space, put it to a safe place, and out comes the already unclipped rubber hose, which you push down to get it out easily. Once this is done, then you'll need to disconnect the dipstick, because the dipstick is bolted by one bolt to the throttle body. Now we need to dismount the throttle body, where there are two longer bolts and one very long one, which goes all the way through the throttle body and through the EGR valve and is bolted to the manifold. Might be a bit tricky getting down there. You'll definitely need the help of a small ratchet, and then a good touch to feel the threads of the bolts. Not sure why, but I suddenly decided to go for the EGR hose, where are two bolts, before removing the throttle body. This is not necessary, I just somehow decided to do it prior removing the throttle body. So you'll need an M10 socket and find some space. It's also a good idea to mention that while doing this job, then you really want to make sure that you don't drop any bolt down below, because then you would have to lift the car and take out the bottom engine cover. So you get these bolts, yeah, so it's just extra work that you don't have to do. Also between the EGR hose and the valve there is a seal, or basically a gasket, that needs to be changed, taken out, because of course with the new valve we get a new one, so I'm taking out the old one. So we are continuing with the throttle body where we just stopped, so removing a couple of more bolts. To get the last bolt out, it's easier to hold apart and unbolt, because otherwise by the weight of the part it might be harder to take the bolts out. And here's the last longest bolt and the throttle body out. So now the EGR valve itself, and there are two bolts remaining, two smaller ones, before we can take the valve out. I'm really being cautious with these bolts because I just don't want to find them at the bottom engine cover. That's what they look like. Hold the valve in place and take out the last one. Carefully, of course. There we go. Now we just disconnect the valve from the electrics using the help of a screwdriver, and the valve comes out. And you're not wrong, it looks new. It actually is new, except it's a faulty part I have replaced in the past. It's also good to mention that it's a good idea to put a rug or something into the plastic hose, which can be seen at the bottom, because you don't want your bolts, in case you drop them, falling down in there. Once the valve is out, then of course it's a good idea to clean all the surfaces from any dirt, carbon, debris, whatever. We're installing a new part so that everything is clean and nice. Also during this job it's a good idea to take a look at the thermostat and its state. Mine is already changed and working good, but in case your engine had cooling problems, and this is where the term thermostat is actually located. It's not exactly seen in the video, but you just locate it down there, and if you were to replace it then you would have to remove the EGR valve anyway, because you wouldn't have enough space to get to it. With me everything's fine, I just love to double check things. Just did a little bit of a cleaning down there, and we can continue with the EGR valves. So here's our brand new one. I didn't go for the original Valeo part, since the Valeo part that has been there before the faulty replacement has been faulty and it was intermittent fault. So I just thought of trying out some other brands, and I went for AIC Germany. Unfortunately the valve turned out to be faulty with a sporadic fault. Now we are replacing again with a Magneti Marelli. I had a chat with the seller or the dealer, and he told me that this brand should be much better quality than the AIC Germany part, and it's still offered at about 25% less than the original Valeo parts. It's a little curiosity, but here you can see that there's a small like flap on the stick of the valve, and it's exactly the same on the original Valeo part. I still kept it just to be able to show you the similarities or differences. This is the faulty Valeo EGR valve, which was there previously, and there you can also see the flap, and this is how it looks from the bottom and the other side. Part number, basically Valeo part. Well, coming back, here's the part from AIC Germany. You can see there is no flap actually in there, and also the opening of the valve is a little bit different for the AIC Germany than the Magneti Forelli. But the Magneti Forelli is actually almost identical to the Valeo part. Actually, it is identical, it just doesn't carry the Valeo name on it. I'm just wondering why the AIC Germany didn't really bother to do these things. I don't know, maybe it just doesn't make a difference, but I just noticed these differences. Thought it's worth showing. Alright, here's our new EGR valve. The EGR valve comes with 4 bolts, 2 bolts to mount it into the manifold and 2 to mount the EGR hose into the valve. And then there's the throttle body with 3 bolts, 2 longer ones and 1 very long that goes all the way through the EGR valve and is bolted to the manifold. So the process is basically the same except it's reversed. So we start mounting the new EGR valve, we connect it to the electronics. And then we're gonna bolt it. Once again, careful not to drop any bolts. Once bolted, you can tighten these bolts right away and move on. Next, we attach the EGR hose, so when your gasket comes in, make sure you put it the right way in, and we can also fully tighten the hose. Now it's time for the throttle body and the longest bolt. Hold the throttle body in place and bolt it. After all bolts are bolted and tight, we can bolt back the dipstick. Once done, the rubber hose comes back in. Don't forget to pull up the rag that we've used to cover the bottom hose. Once in place, we're gonna clip the hose using the metal clips. There's 2 of them, and we are almost done. You connect back the throttle body cable, and that's basically it. You're ready to go. You do a final check, clear the engine codes, and that's done. I have to say that I've already driven about 500 kilometers with the car, and the valve is absolutely perfect. No error codes, no issues, so I can only recommend. Thanks for watching. In case you run into similar issues, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.